Hello and welcome to Lesson 4. I'm Jack Gately, your instructor, owner of Jack Gately Real Estate and the Real Estate School. And I'm glad to have you here for Lesson 4. We're going to talk about agency. Going to talk about agents and agency. Sometimes we refer to the phrase agency not by like it's a real estate agency, but by the fact that it's a type of agency. And I don't mean commercial agency versus a residential agency. I mean the type of services and therefore the type of duties that are due a client or also known as a principal. So when we speak about agency, we're talking about, for the most part, we're talking about the duties that are due a client. Sometimes the client is referred to as the principal. So client and principal, oftentimes the same thing. So when we talk about agency, we're talking about the type of duties that are due the client or the agency, not just the fact that they tend to practice a certain type of real estate or anything like that, but the fact that they're expecting certain duties, which we're going to discuss in this particular chapter, from their agent. And this is the chapter where we discuss what are your duties to your client. Incredibly important for the exam. Everything that we talk about in these videos is important for the exam, but incredibly important for real life. I mean, this is the kind of the meat of your essential duties that you're going to be offering to your clients. So first off, I think we need to start and understand what the difference is between a general agent versus a special agent. A special agent. Now, we don't mean James Bond. We mean a real estate agent. A real estate agent, right? Real estate agent, because a general agent, for instance, is going to have authority to talk about an act on behalf of the principal or the client on a broad range of issues. There's an O in there, there's a D there. On a broad range of issues, a general agent has a broad range of responsibility. A special agent, the best way to think about it is a special agent is limited. And if you were with us when we spoke about the difference between general warranty deeds. Remember that lesson? If you hadn't taken it yet, we'll just give you a quick remember. A general warranty deed started on the day of closing, covered any defects in the title for as long as the seller had it, and any defects anytime before that. But a special warranty deed only covered from the day of closing back for as long as the seller owned it. See how it's limited? The same idea applies to the type of agency that you offer. A general agent is going to be a broad grant of authority. A special agent is going to be narrow. It's going to be limited. In other words, you're there to market the property. You're not there to sell their boat or their car or their baseball card collection or anything else like that. You're there usually for one reason, to market the property and or to represent a buyer who is going to be buying the property. You're not there for a broad range of activities. So keep that in mind. Now, there are some people that are out there that act as a general agent. For instance, an attorney might be a general agent, but we're going to be, as real estate agents, special agents. We're special agents. So we're special agents. There you go. So very important way to think about the overarching concept of agency. Now, when we talk about the types of agents that are out there, there's the first thing that we should be kind of keeping in mind is that there are single agents. Single agents. Single agents. And these single agents work for one part of the transaction, one side. Sometimes we call a transaction a side. You have one side or the other side. For instance, you might represent the buyer or you might represent the seller. You represent one or the other, not both. So a single agent is singular to either the buyer or singular to either the seller. Ooh, that sounds like a good vocabulary word for the exam, doesn't it? Yes, the single agent. Now that begs the question, of course, if there's a single agent, could there be a dual agent? A dual agent. Yes, and it's a beautiful thing if you're a dual agent, because if you're a dual agent, you represent the buyer and the seller, and the seller, and the seller at the same time, but only if they agree and consent in advance. In advance. They have to say it's okay in advance before we get to the nitty-gritty of the whole negotiation. They have to agree and consent in advance and in writing. Okay? Very important. We're going to talk about this a little bit deeper in just a few minutes. There's another thing that also exists under the type, and these are all special agents. Whether you represent the buyer or you represent the seller or you happen to be a dual agent, you're still a special agent. So keep that in mind, because you're only there still for the real estate transaction. Then there's this other thing called, we're still using red, that's okay, designated agent. Designated agent. All right, let's go back to a yellow for you. Might be a little bit easier on your eyes. A designated agent is an agent that works at an agency. Put a little smile on this agent's face. There we go. And they work under an agency. And they work for a seller. The thing is this might be a big agency, and there might be some other agents over here in a different part of the office. There they are there. And the thing is that there might be some other agent in the office that's working under the same umbrella. Oh gosh, we'll try to draw an umbrella for you. It's working under the same umbrella of the agency. But, for instance, this person here, they are working for the buyer. They are working for the buyer under the same umbrella of the same agency. So, this is called designated agency. Designated agency. And if you think that that's a little bit tricky, it is. In fact, there was a recent court case in California. We won't get into that today for your lesson, but basically there has to be a wall, figuratively, built between the designated seller agent and the designated buyer agent, this person here. If they're working working a separate side of the transaction in the exact same office. So that's called designated agent. Designated agent. That can come up any number of ways. What happens if you're at an open house, for instance, and you propose that you do agency? Hey, how are you? Thanks for coming to the open house. Do you have an agent that brought you here today? No, I don't. Okay, I can be glad to help you out. You'd like to make an offer? Okay, fantastic. Let's sit down and talk about a form that we need to fill out before we go forward with your offer called the dual agency form, which we're going to take a look at in a minute. If someone decides they don't want to do dual agency, for instance, then someone in the office would be designated the other agent to represent them. That's a pretty good example of how dual agency might come about. It also might come about if you're in an office with a lot of people. So there's a lot of agents in this office. Let's try that again. There's a lot of agents in this office. Let's just say it's an office of I don't know, 100 agents. 100 agents in one office. And Susie Q got the listing, and she's the list agent. And then somebody else in the office, I'll just call him Bob, he found the buyer. So there's another example of designated agent, and it should be like a brick wall, figuratively, like the Berlin Wall should come down between the two. To separate the two, so that each of them should represent their own principal, which would be the buyer and or the seller, right? The seller, separately. And when this does occur, if you do happen to be in office, you always want to take precaution whenever you're sharing any type of verbal information over the phone, negotiation or whatnot, and or your paperwork, but maybe even especially just a little bit more when you have designated agent situation, because you're going to have somebody else in your actual physical office that represents the other side of the transaction. So always use some caution with communicating, but maybe even a little bit more caution when you have designated agent. We're going to show you some more paperwork on that in a few minutes. So let's talk about some other types of agent. There's this thing called sub-agent. Now, here in Massachusetts, we don't do sub-agent much anymore. Nope. In fact, in the MLS, when it mentions the compensation that people are going to be providing, very often you'll see, for instance, 2.5%. That's a fairly frequent thing that you see for the buyer side, and 1% for facilitator, and we'll talk about facilitator today. And then sub-agent is almost always 0 or non-applicable, depending upon how they write it, because they're not offering it. Basically, it's not done very much in Massachusetts. It's kind of a leftover from a time when back in the early 90s, or certainly in the 80s, there was a time when buyers there was no facility in the law for buyers to have their own agent, and so they would have a sub-agent working for them. Now, not to get too complex over here, but a sub-agent, let's write that actually on the bottom of the page just to kind of get a better idea. First, we have the seller. And the seller technically has a relationship technically with the agency, right? Not technically the listing agent themselves, because the listing agent works for the agency, list agent. And so the sub-agent would be down here. It would be the agent of the agent. Agent of the agent. Agent of the agent. Yeah, we don't do this anymore. It can expose the seller and the agency to what we call vicarious liability. So if this agent down here said something that they shouldn't have said, other people could be held liable for this person's actions. So we don't do that in Massachusetts. There may be some other states that do it, but we haven't done it for quite some time. It does kind of cling on as a law, and no one's actually gotten rid of it, but from a practical, everyday point of view, it's not used. Okay, so I just want to talk about a universal agent. There we go, universal agent. I just want to make clear that this is usually somebody that has the power of attorney, And let's compare that again back to the general agent. The general agent usually is somebody that is involved in a business, for instance. Could be a staff member, an employee, somebody that's working there on a regular basis and handles a wide range of activities for the principal or the client. That's again compared to a special agent, which is probably going to be you, the real estate agent. You're there just for a limited purpose. So you should probably be able to compare and contrast these three types of agents when you're taking the exam and for real life as well, and understand that your duties as a real estate agent are special, which means that they're not broad. If someone comes in and says, hey, I want to buy the car in the driveway, you can't sell the car in the driveway on behalf of your client. You're there just for the real estate, and that's it. Now, not everyone out there acts as an agent in a real estate transaction. You can have someone who is a licensed salesperson or a broker who actually acts as a non-agent in the transaction. Jack, what does that mean? How can you be a non-agent? Well, you don't actually represent the buyer or the seller in that particular case. You're barely bringing the people together. You're using your good offices, so to speak, to facilitate the transaction, but you're not taking sides. You're not on the buyer's side or on the seller's side. You're just helping them come together, and they do the negotiation on their own. So sometimes if the parties can handle all of that themselves, they might need a facilitator to help with something relative to the negotiation or something relative to the expertise on the property. They might bring in a third party to be that non-agent. Occasionally, some people will be asked to be named a facilitator. I've seen agents do this when they're seeking a listing. If they go to a listing appointment and they want to be able to come back and bring the buyer, heaven forbid they don't get the listing. So it's kind of like a plan B. Hey, I'd really want to list your house, but if you don't, could you name us as a facilitator so that will give us the legal flexibility? And we're going to take a look at this a little bit deeper in this lesson. That'll give us the legal flexibility to come back and represent the buyer should we find a buyer for you in the future. So that's a thing, and we're going to take a little bit deeper look. When you're a facilitator or a non-agent, you owe less fiduciary responsibilities. Oh boy, that's a big word. You got to know that one for the exam. Your fiduciary responsibilities. Let's write that on the chalkboard here and start to talk about what are the fiduciary responsibilities, because that's basically the essence of your duty. Let's go with yellow there. Let's go with yellow. I'll change that for you real quick. Let's go with yellow. There we go. Fiduciary responsibilities. UCIARY. Ooh, those are really, 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 really important. Your fiduciary responsibilities. It's the essence of what you're doing for your client. And we have a little acronym for those. I definitely write this down. It makes them easier to remember. And I didn't make this up. This is made up by somebody else. It's called Old Car, and it starts with obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accountability of funds, and reasonable care and diligence. Now we're going to go over each and every one of these so you understand what they are. And for the exam, and most certainly for real life, you're going to need to know what they are and how to adhere to them in practice, because most likely on the exam and then again in real life, you're probably going to have scenarios that pop up. And during these scenarios, you're going to be like, okay, what is the ethical thing for me to do? To whom do I owe my duty, my fiduciary responsibility too. And what is that duty? And sometimes you have to really think about that as an agent when you're out there on your toes occasionally from time to time, so that you answer the question in a manner that fulfills your fiduciary responsibilities. It's not a challenge when you know the rules. It's fairly straightforward when you know the rules. But it can be a challenge when you don't know the rules. So that's why you're here in real estate class, of course. And let's start off by taking a look at all of these items, these six fiduciary responsibilities in a row, one at a time. So we'll start with obedience. All right, obedience, sometimes known as faithful performance. So this one's fairly straightforward. All of these are fairly straightforward. You just got to memorize them for the exam. It means to follow lawful, and ethical instructions. So if the client asks you to do something and it's lawful and it's ethical, then follow the instruction. It's very simple. If they ask you to do something that's unlawful or unethical, then you are relieved of your fiduciary responsibility of obedience and you don't have to follow it. What would one of those such things be? Well, if they asked you to withhold a material fact, if they asked you to tell someone, hey, the roof doesn't leak when you know that it does, or if they asked you to withhold or keep hush up a red flag issue, that you can't do. You can't do those types of things. So those would be two things that would be a perfect example of one of the loopholes, I guess. The loophole in obedience, it means that you have to follow lawful and ethical instructions up until the point that they're not lawful and ethical. So the next one is loyalty. Now with loyalty, let's go with yellow for you so you can see it a little bit better. Let's go with yellow. There we go. There's yellow. Loyalty is the next one of our old car, right? Loyalty. You're always going to be placing your client's interest first. Client first. They are first, absolutely. Always your interests, agent interest, way down the line. All right, so that one's fairly obvious. The client always comes first. That is a fiduciary responsibility. If you've heard it as a piece of sales pitch or something like that, you hear it from time to time as a sales pitch. But in the end, because we are a fiduciary of the client, we have this obligation to place their interest first. Now, the next one in the old car is called disclosure. These are all so very important. And you've heard some of this word before if you've taken some of the other lessons in the class or watched the videos. An agent must always disclose something to the principal or the client. Let's give you an example, for instance, from a buyer's point of view, from a buyer's agent point of view. Maybe you represent the buyer, you're the buyer agent, and your clients, they love the house. And you're looking over the house, and because you are a real estate professional, you're a pro, and you see something, a light bulb goes off in your head that says, uh-oh, I know they love the house, but there's something here that they're not seeing, but I am seeing because I'm the buyer agent professional, therefore I need to disclose it. Their love of the house is blinding them to the fact that this is probably not a property they should buy because it doesn't meet their recommendations or something like that, and therefore they shouldn't buy the house. Now, in this particular, I just try to come up with a kind of a crazy example. Some of my examples are kind of overdone, just so that you can kind of get the point across. And in this particular case here, what if you're representing the buyer, and they're not from New England, and they've never had a basement because maybe they're from Florida, for instance, where basements are relatively uncommon, and so they're coming up here to New England, they're buying a basement, and maybe there's some real big problem with the basement. There's a foundational problem that's blaringly obvious to you. There's a huge water problem in the basement, something like that. If this happens to be the case, you need to disclose it. You need to speak up and say, hey, you've hired me to do my job for you, and I need to disclose that there's something here to that may affect your decision to purchase the property. So if there's something that comes along that could have a material impact upon their decision to buy the property, you need to speak up, even if it means, even if it means you might not get paid or might not get paid as soon or anything like that. Yes, you have to speak up because your responsibility is to the client first and not to your bank account. So a disclosure, you have to disclose any material fact that may have some type of impact on someone's decision to go forward with any transaction. It doesn't always have to be representing a buyer. So there's disclosure. Now the next one, following our old car analogy here, is confidentiality. Confidentiality. Do we have the right pen color? We do. Fantastic. Confidentiality. There we go, ETY, there we go, confidentiality. This means that you have to keep things that we've mentioned this before in one of the other lessons. You have to keep what the seller tells you or what your buyer tells you on the QT. So it's not for you to share with them or some other party that little Johnny got arrested for drunk driving, or so and so is ill, or anything to do with their personal life. Their personal life of your client is off limits. It's not professional to gossip about your clients. Don't do it. They're going to tell you stuff, and we've talked about this earlier. For instance, how much they're willing to accept, why they're selling. All these types of things fall under the general category of confidentiality. You don't blab about your clients. All right, that one's fairly easy. That one. All right, moving on with our old car analogy. The next one is going to be accountability or accounting of funds. And this basically means that, first off, we should just mention here that in Massachusetts and probably in other states, agents, if you're a salesperson cannot hold client funds. In Massachusetts, only brokers can hold client funds. And usually they're held in the agency's escrow account. So as an agent, if you take a check, there's probably going to be some type of procedure to bring that check back to your office. If you take cash, which would be unusual, but certainly does happen occasionally from time to time, you should be turning that over to your broker of record forthwith. Your broker of record, BOR. We'll talk about that later in one of the other modules. I think module 7, maybe lesson 7 or lesson 8. But anytime you take any type of cash money, you got to turn it over to your broker forthwith. Make sure you get a receipt. And of course, if you take cash, make sure you give a receipt. So the other big rule relative to accounting of funds is that you can't commingle. Let's write that one down. Ooh, that is a serious one. Commingling. Very serious. This could land you in Jail. Jail. This could be big, big trouble. This basically means that you're taking money that belongs to the client, it's client money, and you're taking it and you're going to, I don't know, Vegas. And if you do that, you're going to go to jail. So it's a criminal offense. You cannot move client money from the escrow account, and send it over to your personal account, for instance, and go to Vegas or some other place like that. And if you do, you will go to jail. So it's a huge, I'm joking about it, but it's a huge, huge violation of your fiduciary responsibilities. It really isn't something to joke about, but I just wanted to drive home the point. We are going to talk about in lessons 7 and 8. Unfortunately, people from time to time in Massachusetts do this type of thing. They commingle the funds. So remember, on a transaction, the brokerage is probably going to take usually like $1,000 deposit on your typical $300,000 or $400,000 house, and then on the purchase and sale, they're probably going to take another $9,000 to $15,000 or so $1,000, maybe up to $16,000, $17,000 at the P&S. So when you get that money all added up, and this for just one transaction, you have $17,000. When you add that up, multiplied by many transactions, there's a lot of money sitting in that escrow account. And if you have to send in the college tuition, or you want to buy a boat, and you're the person at the agency that has the authority to withdraw money from the escrow account, then you've created a criminal act, and you've mixed the escrow account with the personal account. And that is an absolute no-no. You can't do that, because you're not allowed to withdraw the money out of the escrow account until the transaction has actually closed, or until the transaction has collapsed and you receive a joint instruction from both the buyer and seller to release the escrow funds. So that's a very important one under your old car. That is going to be accounting of funds, or accountability. And the last one is reasonable care. Reasonable care. Reasonable care. Well, this is a wide-ranging catch-all for our old car. Remember, we had obedience, then we had loyalty, then we had disclosure, confidentiality, accounting of funds, and reasonable care. Obedience, again, was following lawful instructions. Loyalty was placing your client first. This is instructions. Disclosure was sharing information with your client. And this one here is confidentiality, keeping certain things secret if it's lawful. Accountability, keeping track of the money. And reasonable care, well, that's just how should we say, it's a catch-all. It's a catch-all. And it can vary from time to time about what actual reasonable care is. And there's always court cases that are coming up that's saying certain things are now reasonably expected. But let's just give you an example. If you wrote in your listing sheet that the house had natural gas as a heating source, but in fact had oil as a heating source, and you would think that this would be an error that would be discovered by either the buyer's agent, the buyer themselves, the appraiser, or certainly the home inspector. Somebody along the way would have said, wait a second here, I see a big black oil drum in the basement. I don't see a gas line anywhere in sight. But I know of a particular story where an agent accidentally, she was familiar with the street, a veteran agent in this particular town, she was familiar with the street and listed the house as having natural gas as a heating source. Unfortunately, if this was the street here, this particular house was way off the street, way up here, where most of the other houses were down here. And the fact of the matter is, because the house was way off the street, when they built the house, they didn't put the gas line in. They didn't put the gas line in. And she had sold houses on this street before, so she just checked natural gas. And uh-oh, big mistake, because when they bought the house, they closed, obviously, the day they move in. They call up the gas company, and they say, can you transfer the account over to our name? And, of course, the gas company says, we don't have an account there. We don't service your address. Well, that would be something that could have been reasonably taken care of by the listing agent. They should have done it. And yes, there's probably been about a half a dozen other people that should have caught it, but the misinformation started with the listing agent, and they were actually responsible, along with the agency, through the concept of vicarious liability that we spoke about earlier, for buying a new gas line here. So yeah, so much for your big paycheck commission, or whatever money that they covered. It was probably also covered by the insurance policy from the agency, known as an errors and omissions policy. We'll talk about that later in lesson 7 or lesson 8. But there's a good example of reasonable care. So old car, definitely kind of the bedrock of everything that should guide you as a real estate agent. This is it. This is where it sits right here. Old car, you're going to need it for the exam, and you're going to need it for real life. It would be a good thing to be able to know all the old car responsibilities: obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting of funds, and reasonable care and diligence. And it would also be good for you to be able to tell one from the other. In fact, on the exam, it would not going to be a big shocker to me if you get a question that'd be like a scenario that says something like, Agent Bob did something. What Agent Bob did was wrong. Why was it wrong? Under which fiduciary responsibility did he violate? And of course, one of the two that usually get people tripped up are these two here: disclosure versus confidentiality. Disclosure is when you learn something that you must tell your client. Confidentiality is when you know something about your client, but you blab it to somebody else. So those two usually get confused and expect a type of question like that. So when is it that we actually owe these types of responsibilities? What is the triggering aspect that creates this type of agency that we've been talking about, where we actually owe these duties? What happens? How do you know when you owe these duties? When does the clock start ticking that you owe these duties? Let's talk about that right now. So under the law of agency, wow, that sounds like it's going to be on the exam, doesn't it? Law of agency. In fact, the law of agency is what we've been talking about when we've been talking about our old car responsibilities. Under the law of agency, agency is actually created when we have an express agreement. And this is, how we do business normally. We head out to someone's listing, a single family home or a condo or something like that, for instance. We sit down at the kitchen table, and hopefully they say, yes, we'd like you to market the property. And just so happens that at the bottom of your clipboard, you have a listing agreement available for you to fill out and for them to okay the paperwork. I never like to say the word sign. Nobody ever wants to sign anything. Mom and Dad always said, never sign anything. So I usually use the phrase, just okay the paperwork. So that's how we usually do business. However, agency can be created by other means, and I just want to teach these two for class today. Let's take the last one first, implication. Implication. If someone out there thinks that you are their agent, and you maybe have led them to believe that, but you're not actually their agent, and you don't disabuse them of that concept, then you may be their agent under the concept of implication, and you may in fact owe them all the fiduciary responsibilities that we had just spoken about. So that's one. The other one where agency can be created is ratification. Ratification. So if there's an agent out there acting as an unauthorized agent, I mean they're not they do not have a expressed written agreement, so they're acting unauthorized. If the client or the principal, I should say, either one of those words are interchangeable for the most part, accepts some portion of the deal presented by the unauthorized agent, the client can't split that part of the transaction, and neither can the agent, and therefore the agent might owe the actual agency might be created, and the agent might owe the fiduciary responsibilities. So by far, we're going to be sticking with express contract in how we do business. We have listing agreements that are drafted by your professional associations, and you're going to go out there and get those signed, hopefully many times if you become a successful real estate agent and broker in the future. So listings is where it's at. And now, since we actually have talked about a situation where agency, we've talked about what agency is, what the fiduciary responsibilities are. We've talked about when agency is actually created, and so we know a little bit more about those abstract concepts. We have to shift over and talk about when we're going to disclose agency. When is it disclosed? Wow, there's a lot to concepts about disclosure in real estate, are there not? So whether it's hazardous materials or agency, we're always disclosing something, aren't we? So when do we disclose agency? Well, let's get into that. Here in Massachusetts, we have very particular rules of when you disclose the agency, and typically it's at the first personal meeting. First personal meeting to discuss a particular property. So it has to be a particular property. If they're just talking to you at the bus stop or the coffee shop that they're looking for a 3-bed, 2.5 bath, 2-car garage, then that's not a particular property. But if they say 123 Maple Street, now that's a particular property, and you have to discuss and disclose the type of agency relationship that you're offering them. So at the first personal meeting, the type of agency must be disclosed when a particular property, a specific property, is discussed. Let's go over how that actually works in real life and for the exam. Now, as a Massachusetts real estate agent and or broker, you're going to be using this form, which we have here in front of you on your screen, the Massachusetts Mandatory Licensee Consumer Relationship Disclosure. Wow, that is a mouthful. And yes, my personal opinion is that this form isn't very consumer friendly, even though that it's what it's supposed to be. But it does, if you're looking at it for the very first time, looks a little bit intimidating. Looks like it's something you might want to take over and read overnight or ask your lawyer about. But it's important to note that this is not a contract. In fact, it says that right here, this is not a contract. I've seen some agencies shrink this page down, put their letterhead at the top, and then add that right across the top. This is not a contract because the disclosure is simply information that you're providing to your client, usually your buyer and or your seller, letting them know what type of agency relationship they should expect. You're going to be using this form, hopefully, all the time, and it's going to be either available to you through the State of Massachusetts Board of Registration website, or will be available to you through electronic means at your agency, or there'll just be a stack of them someplace that you can get a copy of. You can always run them right off the website. Available, they're everywhere. So it's drafted by the Commonwealth, and it is designed to inform the consumer what's going on here. What type of relationship, what type of agency do I have with this agent sitting before me? Remember, if we're at a listing appointment and we're having them sign a listing agreement, then that listing agreement, the express contract, is what actually establishes the agency relationship. This is just simply a disclosure which basically informs the client what they're getting. So let's go through it. I find that a lot of agents, they use this on a daily basis, but it's been a little while since they've actually read the form itself. So let's take a look at it. It's very right on point in terms of this lesson that we've been talking about today, especially all your fiduciary responsibilities. This is actually a 2-page form. It comes with this page and with a second page, which we'll talk about in just a second. And some of the words on the second page are going to sound very familiar to what we spoke about when we spoke about the old car relationship. So this disclosure is provided to you, the consumer, by the real estate agent listed on this form. Make sure you read both sides of this form. The reverse side, which we're going to get to, contains a more detailed description of the different types of relationships available to you. This is not a contract. You're going to get that question all the time, and again, I like it when my agency, we've actually revoted this. I've seen other agencies do it. They write, this is not a contract, because people ask that question all the time. When should the licensee provide this to the consumer? All real estate licensees must present this form to you at the first personal meeting to discuss a specific property. The licensee can represent you as the seller or represent you as the buyer. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit as we go along, and also can assist you as a facilitator, which we talked about before. That's a type of agent, a non-agent who works for neither side. All right, so this is the part that gets you, the real estate agent, kind of off the hook in regards to what you are required to do and what you're not required to do. So, actually, I just want to stop real quickly here and say that in my business, because people can find me on the internet, maybe more than your average agent, especially with my YouTube videos and whatnot, I find that I'm getting folks to sign this, and sometimes maybe even before my first personal meeting. They find me on the internet. They're like, Jack is the type of agent for me. And sometimes they actually say Jack's not the right agent for me, and that's fine too. But sometimes I have a small and growing number of people that I actually don't even know. Maybe they've been a referral from a second-hand source or a third-hand source, or maybe they just stumbled across me on the internet. Nonetheless, sometimes I'll send this off to somebody and have them sign it even before they actually see me. I don't think there's any harm in doing that, but at the very latest, it has to be done at the first personal meeting that you discuss a property. And occasionally, I'll do it even before the first personal meeting. So, consumer responsibility and information. Whether you are the buyer or the seller, you can choose to have the advice, assistance, and representation of your own agent, who works for you. Do not assume that a real estate agent works solely, that would be the key word, for you, unless you have an agreement for that relationship. This kind of hammers home the point, doesn't it? With your consent, licensees in the same firm may represent a buyer and a seller in the same transaction. These agents are referred to as a dual agent. By the way, if you're not aware yet, dual agency, when you represent both the buyer and the seller together, that's a beautiful thing, because for the most part, that means you're not going to have to split your commission with another agency. So if it's a $350,000 house, for instance, the gross commission on that is somewhere like $18,000, plus or minus 17.5 about, and therefore it would just be, usually you'd split that. So if it was the difference between Acme agency and Mega agency, that would be split between the two agencies. If you represent both sides of the deal, which you can only do for the most part when you first start with the listing, then you actually get paid double, and you don't have to split your commission with the other co-broke agency, and it's a beautiful thing. It doesn't happen all the time, and sometimes some people it will happen more than others, but it is a beautiful thing when you have dual agency. You represent both sides of the transaction. I actually think it actually ends up to be a little bit less work because you don't have to negotiate and coordinate with some other co-broke agent at another agency. So we'll talk a little bit more about dual agency. We'll talk about it again for sure, but it is nice when it happens. Okay. Also, a buyer and seller may be represented by agents in the same firm as designated agents. The designated seller agent or buyer agent is your sole representative. However, where both the seller and buyer provide written consent to have a designated agent represent them, then the agent making such designation becomes a dual agent. Okay, that makes sense. All real estate agents must, by law, present properties honestly and accurately, and they must also disclose known material defects in the real estate. Well, we've heard that several times already, haven't we? You must disclose known material defects, red flag issues, in the real estate, even if the seller requests that you don't. You must disclose them. You're kind of like the school nurse. You're the mandatory reporter if there's something wrong with the real estate that you are aware of. All right, duties of the real estate agent. This is where you get an off the hook for all sorts of stuff that you're not allowed to and or responsible for. You don't have to do legal advice, tax advice, insurance, or land survey matters. Clients go out and consult a professional in those areas. Real estate agents do not have to perform home inspections, lead paint inspections, or insect inspections, or heaven forbid, septic system inspections, wetlands, or environmental evaluations. So you're off the hook for all of those things. That's good. So when we scroll down here on this form, we're obviously going to check. Let's check in this particular situation. We're gonna represent the seller. So you check that little box there. Relationship with others affiliated. Print the name of the real estate firm that you work for. So, of course, you're going to write in Jack Gately Real Estate, LLC, license number 10,001, right? You write that there. And now you have a choice. This is a very interesting choice. You have to check one of these two boxes. So let's slowly look. And most likely you're going to get some significant guidance from the broker of record at your office about which one of these two boxes that you check. Let's look at box number 1. The real estate agent listed below, the real estate firm or business listed above, and all of other affiliated agents. Basically everyone that works at that agency has the same relationship with the consumer named herein. In other words, they all represent the seller or they all represent the buyer. So why would you check that box? Well, if you were maybe in a, I'll just come up with a scenario. If you were a smaller agency, what we now call as a boutique agency, and maybe you were just an office of 3 or 4 people, and you were trying to compete against mega agency, and you went into the listing appointment and you made a big to-do about checking this top box because you wanted to impress upon the seller that, hey, everybody in my office is going to be working for you. There's nobody else in my office that could be on the other side of the transaction. That's not how we do business. We're all in for you, everybody in the office. Whether we're representing your property on a daily basis or even an occasional basis, we're all in as your seller agents. Because from an economic point of view, if you're just 3 or 4 people, the odds are that you're not going to be bringing the buyer to the transaction. Therefore, in order to get the listing, you might preclude yourself from getting the buyer in the future because just mathematically it's going to be pretty slim that you'll find the buyer directly and be able to benefit from dual agency. Therefore, you're foregoing dual agency in effect by checking box 1, which I just said was a beautiful thing, but I'd much rather have a listing I'd much rather guarantee myself getting listing or put myself in a much better position to get a listing and forego the possibility of dual agency than get nothing. So that's how some people pitch this particular option to the client. I, however, generally actually check box 2 as a general practice, and I think most people do, but you'll find some guidance from the agency that you go to work for. And box 2 basically keeps the options open. It means that somebody else from your agency could bring the buyer. So let's see what that says. Only the real estate agent listed below represents the consumer named in this form. In this situation, any firm or business listed above, list that means up here where you put your name of the agency, and other agents affiliated with the firm or businesses do not represent you and may represent another party in your real estate transaction. So basically, it's a way that if you're working at a big agency, let's just say, I don't want to pick on any particular agency, so we'll just say mega agency. If you're working at mega agency and you have 300 agents, you don't want to preclude one of those other agents from bringing you a buyer in the future. So very likely you're going to check box 2. I actually have my agents check box 2 as well at my agency, which, by the way, is Jack Gately Real Estate. Sorry. But nonetheless, that's usually, most people check box 2. But I can totally get the benefit of checking box 1 from an all-in, we're all boutique agency type of perspective. So down below here, we're going to sign below. I, the real estate licensee, acknowledge this disclosure has been provided in a timely manner. You're going to sign it, print it, put your license number, and date it. Okay, pretty straightforward. The consumer acknowledges it. And there's another little box down here. Check here if the consumer declines to sign this notice. Wow, why wouldn't they sign it? Well, it looks like a contract, even though at the top it said this is not a contract. Now, when you're sitting down with your seller and you're over at their kitchen table and you're doing up the listing agreement, it's very, very easy for you to get their signature on this piece of paper. It's just one of the other pieces of paper. Of course, you're going to present it to them and explain it to them as you should, as you responsibly should, always providing them with a copy of anything they sign. But it's kind of they're sitting down. They got paperwork. Their knee is tucked in under the table. Their belly up to the table. They're ready to sign, and this is one of the several pieces of paper they sign when you get the listing. So it's really not that hard to get a seller to sign this. However, occasionally it can be a little bit tricky to get a buyer to sign this, especially if you're meeting the buyer for the very first time at the property, and it could be a very cold lead, like somebody that got you just straight off the internet, hasn't seen any of your videos, not a referral. Maybe it's a lead that you got from one of these giant websites out there where you may advertise your name against the listings that you yourself have created and your fellow agents have created. Not that I'm picking on anybody in particular, Zillow, but it could be one of those types of leads. And if you're gonna show up at that house or property, whatever happens to be, and have this form in your hand, which the law requires you to present it and ask for their signature at the first personal meeting, and if you don't do it the right way, and you just stuff the clipboard underneath their nose and say, sign this before we show you the property, it's not going to go over very well. So there are many people who have seen this form before. So for those people that are in the marketplace on a regular basis looking at property, they've seen this form. And so it should be okay. But if you happen to be the very first agent, whoever shows them this form, and I would just rather you assume that you are the first agent who's ever showed them this form, then what I recommend to you is to kind of hint that it's coming, either by email or by phone call. Hey, just drop the hint. Humans are resilient, especially if we have the proper expectations set. So I would just let them know, hey, we have a consumer disclosure form that I'll have for you for your signature before we do the showing. Let them know that you're going to be asking them. You just drop the hint, and that usually is fine. However, there is a box. If they decline to sign this notice, you can go forward. Now, having said that, if these folks want to put an offer on the property, great. That was good news for you. You're then going to want them to sign this, because this form here is one of the essential pieces of paperwork that you send in with an offer as general practice. It's not a law, but that is general practice. You're going to send in the offer form, maybe a mortgage letter, copy of the deposit check, and in this form, which names you basically as their agent for that property. So it's part of the evidence that you are the actual procuring cause of the sale. I tripped over myself again, so let me just say that again for you. I'm going to talk more about this later, but it's one piece of evidence that might indicate that you are the procuring cause of the sale. And almost every list agent is going to, or an agency is going to want to see one of these to find out if you actually do represent the buyer. All right, so be graceful about it when you're asking buyers to sign it. Typically, they have seen it before, but never assume that. It's very possible they're seeing it for the very first time, in which case, even though you've seen it for 1,000 times, and you think it's routine, it's not routine to them. So be graceful and do it the right way. So on the back side of this form are the descriptions of the type of agency that are available. So we have seller's agent, buyer's agent. Buyer's and agent and seller's agent, they're similar. The wording is slightly different, but let's just summarize the buyer's agent. A lot of this is going to be very familiar to you. It sounds familiar. The agent owes the buyer undivided loyalty, reasonable care, disclosure, obedience to lawful instruction, confidentiality, and accountability. Wow, that sounds like old car, doesn't it, guys? It sure does. Provided, however, that the agent must disclose known material defects in the real estate. Well, you've heard that, like that's the 12th time, right? It must be important. The agent must put the buyer's interest first and negotiate the best price and terms for their client, the buyer. The buyer may also authorize sub-agents, highly unlikely, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now, so seller agent and buyer's agent are very similar, slight difference, but very similar. Non-facilitator, or non-agent facilitator. So in this particular case here, When a real estate agent works as a facilitator, that agent assists the seller and buyer in reaching an agreement, but does not represent either the seller or the buyer in the transaction. The facilitator and the broker with whom the facilitator is associated owe the seller and the buyer a duty to represent the property honestly and accurately by disclosing known material defects about the property, and owe a duty of accounting of funds. Unless otherwise agreed, the facilitator has no duty to keep information received from the seller or buyer confidential. So, hey, that sounds like a good test question right there. Which of the fiduciary responsibilities does a facilitator not have to provide? Confidentiality would be one of them. They don't have to provide confidentiality. All right, so there's a good test question there. The role of facilitator also applies only to the seller and buyer in a particular property transaction involving the seller and buyer. So in other words, it's just stick to this only. Now, we talked earlier about designated agent at length. I want to just go down and talk a little bit more about buyer's agent at the bottom of this page, dual agent rather, at the bottom of this page. Now, when we talk about dual agency, you're representing the buyer and the seller at the same time. Inherently, there is some type of conflict with that. There's really no way to describe it other than the fact it is a beautiful thing because you're going to get paid double what you'd otherwise normally get paid, and it is rather uncommon that you're going to bring the buyer and the seller to the transaction. But from a consumer point of view, it's less agency. It's less agency. You know what? The best way to describe this is actually see what it says here. Written consent to dual agency must be obtained by the real estate agent prior to the execution of an offer to purchase a particular property. All right, so that's very important right down there. So you're at the open house that it is for your own listing, and someone comes up to you and they say, hey, I'd like to make an offer. And you're going to say, great, fantastic. Are you here with your agent? Did your agent send you here? Do you have an agent? And you get through that hurdle. They don't have an agent. They just saw the open house sign. They stopped on in and they love the house. Perfect. So you sit them down at the kitchen table and you say, hey, before we go forward in talking about your offer, we have to make sure that we talk about dual agency, or the fact that how I'd like to say it usually as a general phrase is I want to let you know that I'm going to be representing you and the seller equally in the transaction. Is that okay with you? Yes, it is, Jack. Fantastic. So there's a form that recognizes that relationship called the dual agency form, and I'm going to have it just by coincidence. I have it here, and we'll fill that out, and then we'll get started on your offer, okay? And so that's how usually I pitch it, so to speak. But look at what it actually says. A dual agent, we're right here if you want to read along with me. A dual agent shall be neutral with regard to any conflicting interest of the buyer and seller. Consequently, and this is really where the rubber meets the road, consequently, a dual agent cannot satisfy fully the duties of loyalty, full disclosure, obedience to lawful instructions, which is required of an exclusive seller or buyer agent. In other words, if you're a dual agent, you can't provide those fiduciary responsibilities. Wow, that sounds like a good test question. A dual agent does, however, still owe a duty of confidentiality of material information and for the accounting of funds. The written consent for dual agency must contain the information provided for in the regulations, blah, 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 blah. You can find a sample form at the board's website. So, bottom line is dual agency is less representation for each consumer. It's less representation for the seller, and it's less representation for the buyer. But people do it all the time because real estate agents, understanding that they're going to probably put in less work and get paid double, so it's a huge productivity gain. Real estate agents become fairly adept at encouraging people to consent to dual agency. And one way to consent to dual agency is to, here's the form here, is to actually have the seller consent to it in advance through the listing agreement. And so the listing agreements that are provided by your professional associations, one of them usually has, there's usually two available at least for residential property. One will be the standard listing agreement, and then there will be another which includes, there'll be a paragraph in there that includes consent to dual agency. So as you're filling it out, you might say something like, okay for me to advertise, yes. Okay for me to put a sign out front, yes. Okay for me to bring the buyer, yes. You just check that box, and consent to dual agency is built right into the listing agreement. Now, let's go back to our scenario where we found somebody at the open house. They want to make an offer, and first, before we actually talk about the offer, we have to bring out this form, consent to dual agency, because remember, our seller has already agreed to dual agency as part of the listing agreement, but this is the first time we're encountering the buyer altogether. So here we have the consent to dual agency form. It's fairly straightforward. Buyers and sellers should understand that material information received from either client that is confidential may not be disclosed by a dual agent except if expressly authorized. Such disclosure is required by law. Such disclosure is intended to prevent illegal conduct, or such disclosure is necessary to prosecute a claim. So in this case here, let's go back to the top part. A dual agent is authorized to assist the buyer and seller, but shall be neutral with regard to any conflicting interest. So this is the same language as before. Everyone signs it down here. I agree and acknowledge. The buyer and seller sign it here, and then you sign it down here. Provide your license number in today's date. I, as a best practice, recommend that when you get back to the seller with this offer, that you bring this dual agency form back to them, even if they consented to dual agency as part of their listing agreement. I like to bring this form back to them to have them sign it again, just so that they understand completely and refresh their memory. Now, technically, they've already consented to it, but I usually bring this form back to them again. And of course, if they're going to accept the offer, then usually they're very happy with you anyways, and they'll be more than happy to sign this particular form, the consent to dual agency form. The other one that we had up there it is here, is the consent to designated agency. And as I said earlier, this is a situation where two agents working under the same umbrella of the same firm are working different sides of the transaction. So there's a particular form for that. Everyone signs it, and you sign at the bottom a license number and today's date. So very straightforward stuff. You're going to be using these forms all the time. Certainly the mandatory license disclosure form that we started off with. That again is a 2-pager that lists all of these types of agency that are available. You're going to use this one all the time. Hopefully you'll be using the dual agency form, and from time to time you'll be also using the designated agency form. So let's talk a little bit about at this time, at the first personal meeting, why it's so critical at this first personal meeting as well to discuss any type of conflict of interest that you have, or indirect or minimal interest that you have in the property. So let's get on to that. So at this first personal meeting that we've been using this disclosure form, that's also when you want to describe to any particular parties that you're also the seller. So agent is seller, as we've mentioned before. It's also the time when you're going to disclose agent is a family member, the seller is a family member of the agent, or a business partner of the agent. So always disclose this at the first personal meeting. I prefer, and I think the best practice is, if you disclose these types of things, agent is the seller, agent family member or business partner of, I prefer that you do it in the listing itself. So if you're using the MLS, there's a disclosure field, And this is where you are going to occasionally see agent, I misspelled that, sorry. Agent is family member, agent is family member, or something like that. Agent is fill in the blank. That's when you need to disclose this type of thing at the first personal meeting, or preferably even before that in the listing itself. That's when I like to disclose it. Remember, a conflict of interest is when you have competing interests at heart here, and as a result, the outcome of the transaction could be perversed by these competing interests. Or at least there could be a perception that the outcome of the transaction was in some way altered because of these competing interests, even if in fact it was not. Additionally, reason why you disclose the fact that you as an agent are actually selling your own home, in most states, if you're selling your own home, it does not need to be disclosed. If you're just listing it by yourself, like for sale by owner. But certainly if you're putting it on the MLS, highly likely you're going to want to disclose it. What you never want to do is later on have the buyer sue you and say something along the lines like, well, because the listing agent was the seller, because the listing agent was the seller, you as the listing agent, because you had superior knowledge in the real estate field, you took advantage of us or something like that. So if the agent is the seller, you want to not have that type of charge be leveled against you in the future, and you want to disclose it right up front. In the end, does it really matter? Do a lot of people care? Most people don't care. But if you don't disclose it, there's that small sliver of a chance that they may care later, and therefore come knocking on your door. This is also the time at the first personal meeting to disclose any indirect or minimal interest somebody has in the property. So let's talk about this particular problem, indirect interest. I'll give you an example here, indirect interest. An indirect interest, for instance, if you're selling your neighbor's house and here's the property line, here is their house, and here is your house, and you have an easement through their backyard over here to get to, say, a pond, that's a minimal interest in this property, right? That's an interest in this property, and this is where you live here, and this is the listing, this is what's for sale. And if you have an easement to walk over their land to get to the pond, you need to disclose that. So that's a good example. That's a really good example of what I'd say is a minimal interest. The other flip side to that would be, for instance, like in a domino transaction. Sometimes someone's selling their house in a row. So there's a lot of transactions all stacked up, and they're going to fall like dominoes in a row on the same day. The lawyers tend to get a little concerned that everyone gets concerned that everything is going to go okay. But in this particular case, this would be an indirect interest. So if A is going to buy house B, and B is going to buy C, and D is going to buy, and C is going to buy D. You get the idea. If person A has an agent named Bob, and person B has an agent named Mary, that's fine, right? So Bob's going to buy Mary's house. Okay, Bob's going to buy, Bob is A, and I've totally tortured this example. So let's start over again. So the other flip side to that would be like in a domino transaction where you have, for instance, Agent Bob and Agent Mary down here, and you have the clients, Client A, Client B, Client C, Client D. They're all going to sell the house. They're all going to sell houses all on the same day. A is going to buy B's house. B will then buy C's house, and C will then buy D. And they're going to use the proceeds from B, for instance, to buy C, of course, right? So in this particular case, A buys house B. And the only thing is, what wasn't disclosed in this particular situation, or this would be a case of an indirect financial interest, is that the people who sold house B and are going to buy house C, what they didn't know was that Mary was also the owner of house C. Ooh, so wait a second. Mary is supposed to be the agent of person B, but she's also the seller of house C. So therefore, she had an indirect financial interest in the transaction, more than what was disclosed, that she's going to get a commission or a fee out of it. Everyone knew that, but what people didn't know is indirectly she was also going to benefit, because person B, her own client, was then going to turn around in like 20 minutes or a half an hour later and buy Mary's house C. And so this would be an example of an indirect financial relationship, which should have been disclosed at the time of way up front at the first personal meeting to disclose the situation, or at the very least as soon as this type of situation developed. I can totally understand how this may not have developed until later on, and there does certainly seem to be there has to be some type of intent to deceive. And sometimes this type of thing does not have intent, but still can be a significant violation. So we always go back to the rule. What in all of these situations, when in doubt, we disclose. When in doubt, we disclose. That's the rule we want to follow. When in doubt, disclose, of course, except if it's some type of personal, confidential information about your client. So let's talk about when agency actually ends, because we've talked about what is agency. We've talked about when it starts. We're talking about the types of agency and the responsibilities of agency. But when does it actually end? So when does agency actually end? Well, it ends most commonly when the listing expires. So mostly in Massachusetts, a lot of listing agreements are for a certain length of time, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. I've had listing agreements go for a whole year. So it really depends upon, I round it up, really depends upon what is good for you and your client and the type of property. I try to go for in my market, Plymouth market, for instance, it's going to take 3 to 4 months to sell your average house in Plymouth. So I'm looking for, 90 to 120 days listing agreement. Every agency is different. It just depends upon, and every property is different too. So I usually round these off round numbers, and that's what I'm looking for. But it ends when the listing expires. So the next one, when it ends, is if you sell it, or you lease it for that matter, when you've completed and accomplished your task. The next one is by force of law. Now, either there's been some type of change in the law relative to the agency that you've provided. There is a fact that you lost your license, that type of thing. And so by law, you're not capable of entering into the transaction anymore. The next one, of course, if the property with some awful fate resulted in the property and it was destroyed, then agency would have been ended at that time or terminated at that time. And lastly, the good old agreement of the parties. And every once in a while, you're going to have a client which you would be happier if they went along to another agency. And that's the polite way to put it, I guess. And sometimes you might want to actually invite them to go do so, and if they agree that that's also a good idea, then you can come to a mutual agreement of the parties and cancel the contract. Having said that, there are some agencies that the seller will call up and ask to terminate, and the agency will say, hey, listen, well, I see what you want to say. You don't want to sell your property anymore. That's fine. They'll temporarily withdraw it from the market, but they won't cancel the contract because they want to make sure that, heaven forbid, a buyer doesn't come along during the term that they signed up for, that they could then present that buyer. So a lot of people let their contracts run out to their full length, and then it will be expired by the MLS system or when that date happens. So the expiration date of these agency contracts are usually inputted into the MLS system, and the system will just kick it when that date is achieved at midnight or whatever. And then every morning, as a new agent, by the way, since we are kind of hinting about expired listings here, as a new agent, every morning you can go in and get a expired listings report. Ooh, an expired listings report. That sounds like a good source of leads. Absolutely. Remember now, you can't call these people. The do not call list applies. Don't call these people because you don't have an existing business relationship with them. That sounds like an important test question. But you could mail them. And what's the other way you could go about reaching out to people whose listings just expired? Very, very unpopular. No, I wouldn't say unpopular, but it's rare. Very few agents actually do it. You could actually drive over and talk to them. This is Jack. Can I help? And yes, since we're hinting at expired listings here, as new agents that you'll soon be, you should know that expired listings are a good source to get listings. So if somebody had just been recently, as in like yesterday, trying to sell their house, it might be a good idea, if their listing had just expired, to reach out to them and say, hey, do you still want to sell your house? Are you still looking for a buyer? Now, you might want to target your efforts in this regard because, obviously if a house has been on the market 987 days or something like that, there might be something wrong with the house. But if it's been on the market for, 90 days, that's kind of within the margin of error of when your average house sells, at least in my market that I deal with it the most. And so you might want to go approach those people. Now, your first gut reaction would be, why don't I just pick up the phone and give them a jingle? However, because of the federal, and I think there's a state version as well, the do not call list, which most people are on, you can't do that because you do not have an established business relationship. You do not. You might say, well, their listing was on the MLS and I'm a member of the MLS and that's the established business relationship. It is not. You cannot do that. No. You just can't randomly call somebody whose listing just expired. You cannot do that. That is a major penalty. You can face a huge fine for calling people. I know that you can go on the internet and find all sorts of scripts and people coaching you to call expired listings, but by the do not call list, it is a no-no if they're on the list, which most people are on the list. So the other more popular way is to mail them, and the absolute least popular, or I should say rare, is actually drive over to their house and knock on their door. Now, I know some of you might be sitting there and saying, oh, I could never do that. Well, there are a few agents that actually do this, and it actually does work. You can drive over to their house, dress appropriately, walk right up with their expired listing in their hand, and say, hi, I'm Mary, and I noticed that your listing expired last night. Are you still looking for a buyer? And then, you go on from there and talk about it. Sometimes you might be the first person that informs them of that. So, they might say, it expired? Yes, it expired. Here's the expired listing sheet from last night. Didn't your agent tell you? Well, no, I haven't heard from that agent for weeks. Oh, that's a shame. Gee, could you tell me a little bit about the property? Are you still looking to sell it? Well, yeah, I am. Come right in. Oh, okay, I guess I have some time. And so obviously, this is, believe it or not, an incredibly effective, if you're disciplined about it, manner to get listings. Although very, very few people have the, what's the phrase I can use now? The guts to go out and actually do it, but I've done it, and I can tell you that it is effective. And if you have nothing going on and you're just looking at yourself, twiddling your thumbs, and your phone is not ringing and your email is not buzzing, you can put yourself eyeball to eyeball with somebody who wants to sell a house by actually driving out to their house and knocking on their door. If they don't happen to be home, you might leave something for them. Make sure you don't leave it inside the door or in their mailbox, but you might leave something some way without entering the property or leaving it in the mailbox. So that's your pro tip for today relative to expired listings. And it's been a great lesson. I've really enjoyed you here today, and I've enjoyed giving this lesson. I hope that you can see it from me. And we're going to go back to the live webinar portion of the class. Again, my name is Jack Gately, and I'm the owner of the Real Estate School and the owner of Jack Gately Real Estate. So let's go do that.